Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. And today we're kicking off a brand new series on the channel. We're going over our full conference predictions. Now, if you want to vote on the next conference prediction, be sure to go to the community tab and vote. There's going to be 3 options. And last episode, you voted on it. Today we have the Big Ten. Now, in this series, we won't be going in too deep for any specific team. Just a quick summary of what we think are some important details about each team and our predictions. We'll have each team's full schedule on the right-hand side of your screen. The opponents that are labeled in red are losses and green are wins. Pretty self-explanatory, but you never know. Coming in at 18 to start off this video, we have the Indiana Hoosiers. Indiana's coming up in last place in our prediction because they've just never really been a great program under Tom Allen the past 7 seasons. They had 2 okay-ish years in 2019 and the 2020 COVID year. They finished 9-27 in the past 3 seasons under Tom Allen though, and he was fired following last season, and they hired Curt Cignetti from James Madison. And there's a lot to look forward there if you're an Indiana fan. He went 19-4 in his only 2 FBS seasons at James Madison, but he's going to have a lot of work to do. Indiana last year was 111th in total offense and 106th in total defense. There's a long road ahead. It's hard to recruit to Indiana with the neighboring schools like Cincinnati, Notre Dame, Illinois, Ohio State, Michigan in the general vicinity, and there's a lack of football tradition at that school. Like I said, a lot of work to do for Curt Cignetti, but not impossible. And we have them pegged as an 82.9 overall, and we project them to go 3-9 with a winless conference record. And after Indiana at 17, we have the UCLA Bruins. Like Indiana, UCLA comes into 2024 with a brand new head coach, and Deshaun Foster unfortunately has been less than impressive in his first offseason as the head coach for UCLA. He had a bit of a blunder at media day, kind of froze up, didn't know what to say, but that's not necessarily indicative that he's going to be a bad coach. Not saying that, just not a great start. And it's been overall a bad recruiting cycle. Not great out of high school, not great in the transfer portal. But all that can be mitigated by success on the field. But we aren't predicting that for UCLA and Deshaun Foster this year. Coming in and having to adjust to the Big Ten will be rough, paired with all the other changes they face this year. And UCLA could eventually be a pretty good Big Ten team, but with a complete overhaul of the staff, the roster, and the conference, leaves us with little confidence in them this season. We have them at an 82.7 overall, and we're predicting them to go 3-9 this year, just like Indiana, but with a 1-8 conference record. And after UCLA at 16, we have the Michigan State Spartans. Now, you might be noticing a trend here. Michigan State, like the last 2 teams, brings in a brand new head coach in Jonathan Smith from Oregon State, who, for what it's worth, is really good and should have Michigan State back in a relevant position faster than most might think. He turned Oregon State around, who was coming off pretty mediocre seasons prior to his arrival, and he turned them into a top 25 program last season. And like the last 2 teams, it's usually very difficult to flip a team around in a single year. They have a lot of potential, but this year they lack the foundation necessary to be a cohesive and fundamentally sound team. And for that, we have Michigan State as an 86.5 overall. They have talent, and now they have a good talent developer in Jonathan Smith. But in year 1, we have them going 4-8 with a 2-7 conference record. And following Michigan State, we have the Illinois Fighting Illini. Illinois is another team that isn't necessarily known for their deep football history, but Brett Bielema has been able to keep them hovering around average the past few seasons, going 18-19 in those seasons. But we see Illinois being a team that is going to be negatively impacted by conference realignment. They've been able to stay relevant in the Big Ten West the past few years, but the Big Ten West doesn't exist anymore. And Illinois isn't the kind of program that's going to be able to match up well with an Oregon or a USC or even a Washington. And with that being said, we have Illinois listed as an 84.5 overall. Not a terrible roster, but not great. And we project them going 4-8 with a 2-7 conference record also this year. And after Illinois at 14, we have the Northwestern Wildcats. Northwestern was one of the best stories last year. Pat Fitzgerald, of course, is let go before the season. In the interim, David Braun delivers Northwestern to the promised land with an 8-win year and a bowl win over the Utah Utes. But like Illinois, Northwestern was a traditional Big Ten West team who could scrape together a few division wins, and they happened to do so last year. And despite the roster leaving a lot to be desired offensively, we project Northwestern will have a pretty solid defense once again this year, with the team overall coming out to a modest 84.3, and we have them going 5-7 with a 2-7 conference record. Not bad. We'll probably buy Braun another year, and definitely something to build off of in the future. After Northwestern, we have the Purdue Boilermakers, and with all honesty, Ryan Walters just does not do it for us as a head coach. He could absolutely prove us wrong and have a great year this year, but from scheming to philosophy to recruiting, it just feels like he's not going to be a guy who can consistently have Purdue towards the top half of the conference like Jeff Brom did prior to him. And like Northwestern, the offense doesn't look great from a talent perspective, but the defense should be fairly decent. It's just a matter of if Walters can scheme them more effectively and be a better game manager overall. And with that being said, we have Purdue as an 84 flat, and we predict them to go 4-8 with a 3-6 conference record. Despite our opinions on Walters, we think Purdue can pull off a few sneaky wins against some of the other below average big teams this year. There's going to be worse teams from a talent perspective. It'll just be a matter of getting in a position to win those games. And after Purdue at 12, we have the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Minnesota feels like another traditional Big Ten West juggernaut team that probably wouldn't have been nearly as good had they been in the East. Although we have to give PJ Fleck his credit. Minnesota seems like a stable program that can have a pretty solid year any given season, and we also think Minnesota will be a very solid team defensively, but their biggest problem is that they're playing a pretty rough schedule this year. They play North Carolina to open the year at home, which is brutal. They also add USC and UCLA to their schedule alongside Michigan, Iowa, Wisconsin, Rutgers, Maryland, Penn State. It feels like it just goes on, and it's pretty sad to see considering Minnesota doesn't feel like an Indiana or an Illinois. It feels like they could keep being a plus 500 team, but not with a schedule like theirs this year. And with that, we have Minnesota as an 86.7 overall, and we predict they'll be going 5-7 this year with a 3-6 conference record. Not bad, something to build off of, but certainly not ideal for Gophers fans this year. And at 11, we have the Washington Huskies. Now, this may come as a big surprise to you, so if it does, allow us to explain. To put it simply, the Washington Huskies that you saw make the college football playoff national championship last year is not even close to the same Huskies team that will be taking the field in Seattle this year. Kalen DeBoer is gone. They replace him with Jed Fish, who did do a great job at turning Arizona around the past couple seasons, but he's once again starting from scratch at Washington. But unlike some of the other teams lower on this list, Washington is going to come in with a decent roster, and they add Will Rogers, who should be able to elevate that offense to a higher level than that of an Indiana or a UCLA this year. Despite that, it doesn't look like a great season is brewing for Washington, seeing as they play a brutal conference schedule to start off the Fish era. We have Washington coming out to an 86.3 overall, not bad, but because of that schedule, we have them finishing 6-6 with a 3-6 conference record. Obviously not what you want to see if you're a Washington fan, but should be a pretty quick turnaround for Jed Fish, seeing as Washington is still a very relevant program. And coming in at number 10, we have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Things are looking bright this year in New Jersey. You're coming off your first plus 500 season since 2014, and you have a pretty easy schedule heading into the season. On top of that, their defense is projecting to be great this year, and they're going to have one of the best running backs in the Big Ten in Kyle Monangai. But it's not all sunshines and rainbows, surprisingly, for Rutgers. They lose Gavin Wimsatt, and they bring in Ethan Kaliakmanis to be their starting quarterback this year, who was pretty subpar for Minnesota last year. There's a lot of hype surrounding him. A lot of people thought he could be pretty decent for Minnesota last year before not being decent for Minnesota last year. So there is some hype around the move, but likewise to the quarterback, the rest of the passing game is not looking great talent-wise from our perspective. And for that, we're not going to be as high on Rutgers as some others have been, because when you play teams like Virginia Tech, who's on their schedule, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Minnesota, teams like that who are privy to limiting run offenses, you're probably not going to exceed expectations when the passing game is so mediocre. So with that, we have Rutgers shaping up to be an 85.5 overall, and we predict them to go 6-6 with a 4-5 conference record. Obviously nothing to be ashamed of there, and you'll be bowl eligible. And at 9, we have the Maryland Terrapins. Now, unfortunately, they do lose Taulia Tagovailoa, but they are adding a pretty solid replacement in NJ Morris, who looked really good at times last season at NC State. And they're also going to have a defense which should be good enough to keep them in games, as well as a pretty okay schedule other than teams like USC, Oregon, and Penn State, who are their toughest opponents. Pretty moderate all around. And talent-wise, they're going to be in the mix versus a lot of their mid-tier opponents. And we have them winning a game or two that they probably shouldn't, or that they probably won't be predicted to win. And we're going to have Maryland as an 84.7 overall, and we project them to go 7-5 with a 4-5 conference record. And following Maryland at 8, we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. We're starting to get into that upper tier of Big Ten teams, and the first is going to be Nebraska. They're gearing up to have a pretty solid season. They keep Tony White, who was looking like he was going to be a head coach this year, stays at Nebraska, probably going to be a head coach next year. They return almost all of their starters on defense, and they add a 5-star Dylan Raiola, who should elevate that offense that was historically bad last year. And people forget that year 2 of traditional Matt Rule rebuilds are usually where you see his teams flip. They're going to be more confident, they're going to be more developed, more explosive, and they should be in for a pretty decent season this year. Overall, we have Nebraska as an 86.6, and we have them going 7-5 with a 5-4 conference record, which would be their first winning season in conference and overall, and their first bowl appearance since 2016. And at 7, we have the Wisconsin Badgers. Luke Fickell and Wisconsin are a curious case in that they found a way to win despite looking awful at times last year. We think Fickell needs to find a way to bring a more balanced approach to the table offensively, because it's in Wisconsin's blood, it's in their nature to be a run-heavy offense, but Fickell is traditionally a coach who wants to pass the ball more often than not, and he tried to implement that last year, didn't really work out. And we think he can. It may still look a bit shaky this season, but we think Fickell and his staff will find a way to make it work for the most part, and they'll have what should be another top-tier defensive season to thank for making that an easier process. And with that being said, we have Wisconsin as an 88.4 overall, and we have them finishing 8-4 with a 6-3 conference record. And at 6, we have the Iowa Hawkeyes. Now, you can make the case that Iowa is another traditional Big Ten West team that will be negatively affected by the Pac-12 teams joining, and to some degree, you're probably right, but Iowa has a good enough defense year in and year out to keep them in most games, especially this season. Their season this year probably won't look much different than any other Iowa Hawkeyes football season, but we don't think it needs to. Other than Ohio State, they should be in a good spot to win every game on their schedule this year. Will they? Probably not, but you get the point. And the biggest thing for Iowa is that they lose the Brian Ferentz experience this year. And we'll get to see this year if it actually was Brian Ferentz's fault or if his dad is just generally bad at forming modern offenses. And with that, we have Iowa rounding out as an 87 overall. Once again, bad offense, good everything else. And we have them going 9-3 this season with a conference record of 7-2. And after Iowa, we head straight into the top 5, starting with the Michigan Wolverines. Now, if you haven't seen our Michigan season preview, go ahead and watch it after this video. We get into much greater detail about the Wolverines and the road ahead for them in 2024. Basically, like their national championship opponent, Washington, Michigan loses their head coach, Jim Harbaugh, to the NFL, and along with him, a majority of the roster. However, Sharon Moore does have Michigan in a much better place than Fish does at Washington, but still not fantastic by Michigan standards. And we have Michigan rated as a 90.3 overall, and we predict them to go 9-3 with a 7-2 conference record this year. And following the Wolverines, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions at 4. Penn State has been a classic case of when the time is right the past few years, and unfortunately for them, the time has never been right. Regardless of that, we think the James Franklin slander we see from the media is pretty ridiculous. James Franklin is a great coach who really only needs one season to hit it big, and for all we know, that could be this year. They have the defense for it, and if Aller can take a big step in the right direction, the sky is truly the limit for that offense and Penn State as a whole. For us though, it's going to be a matter of having to see it to believe it, because despite having them rated pretty high at a 90 overall, we predict they'll go 10-2 with a 7-2 conference record, the typical Penn State season under James Franklin. And into the top 3, we have the USC Trojans at 3. Might be controversial. USC was essentially the inverse of Iowa last year. They had an all-time great offense that was brought down by an all-time bad defense. And luckily for USC fans, defensive coordinator Alex Grinch is out, and they bring in D'Anton Lynn, which is a massive upgrade for the Trojans. Can't state that enough. At UCLA last year, Lynn was responsible for turning their defense into a top 3 to 4 defense in the Pac-12. And they'll also get to choose from Miller Moss, who looked great in their bowl game, or transfer Jaden Maivia, who is one of the best quarterbacks in the group of 5, to take over for Caleb Williams. 2 very solid options. Will be very interesting to see who gets the most QB1 snaps heading into this season. And with that being said, we have USC as an 89.3 overall, and we predict them to go 9-3 with an 8-1 conference record. 2 big non-conference games versus LSU and Notre Dame, but their conference record is manageable, and that's why we think they'll finish 3rd this year. And coming into the top 2 at 2, we have the Oregon Ducks. Now, unfortunately, we have already talked a lot about the final 2 teams on this list extensively on this channel, so we will keep these summaries short. Oregon is coming in with, in our opinion, the best offense in the country, and will be more talented on both sides in almost all of their games than their opponents this year. Oregon is coming in with, in our opinion, the best offense in the country this year, and they're going to be more talented on both sides of the ball than their opponents in almost all of their games this year. And Dan Lanning is not messing around. He could have left for Alabama. He chose to stay, and he's going to have Oregon in a great place somewhere around the top of the conference year in and year out for as long as he stays there. And because of that, we have Oregon as a 94.5 overall, and we predict they'll go 11-1 with an 8-1 conference record this year. Their only loss in the regular season being to the number 1 ranked team, the final team of this video, the Ohio State Buckeyes. Now, like Oregon, we've talked about Ohio State already on this channel. Be sure to go check out that video after you're done with this one. But it feels like all the chips are on the table for Ryan Day this year, and he has a royal flush in his hand. Ohio State's roster is loaded from top to bottom, and they have a defense that would make most Roman emperors shudder. And it seems like Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, and Jim Knowles are not messing around this year, and that is why we have Ohio State as a 95.4 overall. We are predicting them to have an undefeated 2024 regular season, going 12-0 with a 9-0 record in the conference, en route to a rematch versus Oregon in the Big Ten Championship. And that is going to do it for the Big Ten Conference prediction. If you enjoyed it, be sure to go and like the video and subscribe. Feel free to share with whoever you want, your aunt, your uncle, your sister, your niece, your nephew, anybody you can think of. And if you disagreed with any part of this list, there's probably going to be a lot of you. Feel free to drop a comment. Where do you think we went wrong? Where do you think we went right? Let us know. And be sure to tune in next week for the next conference prediction. If you want to vote on what you think the next conference to get a conference prediction should be, go to the community tab and vote on the next one. And with that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.